months ago, we had one of our members who lives in, I believe, Victoria, give us a presentation about Haworthias in general. And he vaguely mentioned that what used to be considered Haworthia is now 3 different genera, but he touched on that very vaguely and didn't have time to answer Jerry Magnetti's question of what is the difference between the 3 new genera. And instead of taking 10 minutes more out of our time during that minute, I thought, well, I'll just do the succulent of the month in the future and try to cover these 3 genera, well, the basics of it as the succulent of the month. So the 3 genera that used to be one genus, Haworthia, are Haworthiopsis and Tulista, and there are several differences that you can rely on to tell them apart. So they were split off officially in 2013 after some studies were finished off. One thing about genetic studies is that they're not always reliable. There are very many different methods to do it. And I had somebody who studies the genetics of cacti look at which is super complicated, to look at this study, and he thought that the methods were pretty solid and that this is probably pretty accurate, the results. And before they were split into 3 different genera, they were actually split into 3 different subgenera within the genus. So about 100 years ago, the people had already noticed these differences, but they didn't think they were enough to split them into different genera. So now they're placed in the tree of life. They're monocots, so they only have 1 cotyledon when they germinate. They're in the order Asparaginus, so they're related to stuff like orchids and agave. They used to be thought to be in the lily family, which is in a completely different order. But their lilies are still monocots. The family is Asphodilaceae. Some people opt for the name Xanthorrhoeaceae, and I just don't like it because it's something in the butt to spell. And this family is exclusively found in the old world. The lily family is actually widespread throughout the whole planet. We have native lilies in Washington, but they're not related to these plants, at least not that closely. And actually most of the plants in this family are not succulent, but the family does have at least 1,000 species of succulent. And most of these succulents are very closely related to each other in a tribe called Aloe, but there's a few genera that are not, like Bulbini and Trachyandra. Those are succulents, but they are not part of this tribe. So this family includes some things that we're familiar with, like red hot pokers, and you see these everywhere in Washington. Even daylilies. These recent studies determined that daylilies belong in this family. In warmer parts of the world, like Florida and California, people grow things like Dianella. These are from Australia and Tasmania. Everywhere on the planet, people grow cornea. I think you've seen these around. You see them in Washington, Florida, just everywhere, Mexico, California. And some other cool things that hopefully Panetta will touch on. These are aeromoras. They are from Central Asia. Some people, especially in Europe, grow these, and they are beautiful plants. Also because they're from cold deserts in Central Asia, some of these are invasive in Eastern Washington. But now let's get to Haworthia. So one of the main characteristics is that they don't have fibrous leaves. They are very succulent, very soft. They have fleshy roots that have no fiber. You could even call them succulent roots. Some of them have roots that are just so fat and fleshy that you could rip off those roots, pop them out, and those roots will grow into a new plant. I've done it. It takes a long time, but it works. They have, hold on, that is not the right word. These are zygomorphic, not actinomorphic. Zygomorphic means that the flower has bilateral symmetry, so you can only divide it once, and you'll have 2 identical sides. And they are roughly triangular in cross section. And these used to be the former subgenus Haworthia in the old genus Haworthia. So far, does anybody have any questions?
Yeah, what's a retractile root?
So bulbs and other things that have part of their bodies under the ground for various reasons will use these to either pull themselves deeper in the soil or push themselves upward.
Okay,
You'll find that at some point in the year. Some things are really obvious, like daffodils. You see that sometimes daffodils will push themselves up and completely out of the soil. So these roots are very common in bulbs.
And then when you
Camas do that. Camas, I think, do that.
Yeah, they're bulbs. So most bulbs have retractile roots.
the idea with the daffodils and with the orchids in the genus Pleone, is the ones that are sticking up get kicked or knocked away, and when they land, they form roots and pull themselves back into the ground.
Survivors.
So here's a diagram of Haworthia flowers. So this is the base of the flower. That is not the cross section. This is the cross section. Each of this is like the cross section on each of the tepals. And tepals is a fancy word when flowers are confusing, because usually flowers have two distinct components: petals and sepals or sepals. And when you cannot distinguish which is which, you call them tepals. So, in Haworthia, in Haworthiopsis and Tulista, we call them all tepals because we cannot tell which is which. So here are some pictures of true Haworthias. Like this is Cooperi, and it's just one of the wonders of South Africa. It's growing with other things like Crassula and Hibiscus. Here's another Cooperi. This is growing with a Senecio. And this group of Senecios now, that's the beauty of evolutionary biology. This is no longer a Senecio. This is called Caputia. What's the species? Stepidura. So like you saw, some of them grow on rocks. Some of them grow directly in the soil. Like you can see, the plant is partly buried, and when it gets really hot and really dry, it will use its retractile roots to get even deeper in soil so that it doesn't burn. And that's why some of them have that more or less translucent surface, so that most of their body can be underground, but it can still photosynthesize, so that the part that's exposed is transparent, so it can allow the light to reach the part of the plant that's underground. Lithops do that too. Some true Haworthias really resemble aloe. That's when they just resemble miniature aloes, like this one as well, but they still have all the characteristics that I mentioned earlier. Some of them are really distinctive, especially the arachnoidea clay, which are some of the more xeric ones. These are the ones that you'll find in true deserts. Most Haworthias grow in semi-deserts. And again, there's a bunch of others, such as Casteria, Senecio, that's not Dermiscus, that's Anacampsorosis. In South Africa, you don't have to look for succulents, they'll be there. So now Haworthiopsis, just, the name means that it looks like a Haworthia. So they have fibrous leaves and fibrous roots, so the roots are not particularly fleshy. And just like Haworthia, they have zygomorphic flowers. And it varies, but they are sort of hexangular in cross section. Not on all species. Some of them are also triangular in cross section, and they often have a much taller stem than Haworthia. So word coalescent just means that it has a stem, and the word acaulescent means it doesn't have a stem, which it's an iffy word because there are no flowering plants that don't have a stem. They just have a reduced stem, and that's what acaulescent plants have. So you could say that an acaulescent plant just has a much smaller ratio of stem tissue or leaf tissue, something like that. So there are a lot more Haworthiopsis that are tall than rather than squat like Haworthias. And this used to be the former genus Hexangularis. Personally, would have chosen that they just made the three subgenera the new genus name, just to stick with the old information, but also so that it's different, because I think Haworthiopsis is not very creative. So here's a diagram of the flower. It's showing that bilateral symmetry. That's what's called a zygomorphic flower. Here's the base of the flower. Here's the cross section of the flower. This is probably a bad example because I've done some cross section of some other Haworthiopsis, and they are more or less hexangular. And another thing that differs these from Haworthia, but I didn't list it because I don't think it can be used as a trait to determine a different genus, is that they often have a much thicker and stiffer skin. So people in Asia, before these two new genera were determined, were calling Haworthiopsis and Tulista hardly Haworthia, because that's another trait that makes them different. Here's one of the most common Haworthiopsis ever, Haworthiopsis vesselata. It does exist in nature, it doesn't just exist in nurseries. I'm fascinated that it's growing with Titanopsis calcarea. It's a meson, and that plant is very most sensitive. whereas the Haworthiopsis is not. It just fascinates me that these two plants grow in nature together and you cannot carry the same for both. Some of them are alcoholescent too, but not the majority of them. This is Condonurum. This is Glauca. That is one of the more alcoholescent ones, especially in cultivation. These will get up to this tall. This is Cortata, another classic. These can get very tall as well. And it's one of the many that have that classical spotted look, which is not exclusive to Haworthiopsis, but I'll get to that in a minute. This is the zebra Haworthia. This one doesn't have stripes. Some plants in nature do have stripes. This is Attenuata. And then now to Tulista. They also have fibrous leaves, they also have fibrous roots, and they are a lot stiffer and a lot bigger and more robust than the other two. Another difference that they have from the other two that I don't think is worth being used as a reason to separate into a different genus is not being able to grow from leaf cuttings. If you were to take a Haworthia leaf cutting or a Haworthiopsis leaf cutting, if it doesn't die of dehydration, it'll throw new roots and new plants. This you can't do with Tulista, which is a shame. That's why most of the species in this genus are very hard to obtain and very expensive. And these do have actinomorphic flowers. I did make a mistake on this slide, which means that these flowers are radially symmetrical. So you can slide them any way you want and you'll still get identical halves. And the old name for this way was Robus dipendicularis, which I wish they kept that because it just sounds so fancy. So here's the flower diagram on that. It is not perfectly radially symmetrical, but you can still kind of like make a star out of it. It's just that these two peoples are slightly narrower than this one. That's about it. And so some of these, just like Haworthiopsis, have those wide spots in the leaves, but that is just convergent evolution. They just evolved that independently. And like I said, these are much bigger. This is Marginata, which is the biggest of them all. In nature, they often don't get that big, but in cultivation, they can get the size of a small agave. What's this one? That is Kingiana. It just looks like a slightly bigger Haworthiopsis attenuata. There's debate whether this is a species or not. It's a very distinctive form of Tulista minima that has translucent tubercles that goes by the name of Opalina. And it's only known from one locality. And one thing that makes studying it difficult is that the entire entity is in private property. And the owners are not very welcoming of strangers. But such is life. So now some close relatives of Tulista. They are not the closest relatives of Haworthia and Gasteria. They actually split off a long time ago. So among the close relatives is now Aristalo aristata and Aloe variegata, which now is a genus of 3 species called Conialo, and Astroloba, which might be the closest relative of Tulista. And I have an example of that here because this is not an Astroloba or a Tulista. It's actually a naturally occurring hybrid between species of the 2 genera. So I think that should have been insightful many decades ago that something was going on. It is very blurry. I couldn't find a better resolution image, but here is a hypothetical family tree for aloes. And here you'll see they have something called Cortularian on the top, and then aloe back here. After these genetic studies turned out that Cortularian wasn't aloe, and then that this whole thing was entirely wrong. But this was just based off of morphology, and that's it. So then here you have the actual tree. Again, it's hard to read. Wish I we had like a much bigger screen, but that's hard to get. So Haworthia is right here. So this tree basically represents how early as they evolve, they split off. So for example, at one point, there were only these two species, let's say, and each of them kept evolving, and whatever this used to be evolved into these two genera, and whatever this used to be evolved into all of these. So this represents how these plants evolved across time. So Haworthia shares its most recent common ancestor with Camara, which contains two species that used to be included in aloe, and then these four genera, they're Astroloba, Haworthia and Tulista, and then in top you have Gasteria and Haworthiopsis. And for many decades there has been Haworthiopsis Gasteria hybrid going around, but people thought it was just a Haworthiopsis hybrid. And that kind of surprised me because when I looked at the flowers, they look just like Gasteria flowers, but the plant looks like a Haworthiopsis. And somehow people never noticed. And Haworthia collectors get super mad when you share this information with them. And it's like, well, the plants are telling you couldn't have hybridized a Gasteria with a Haworthiopsis that easy if they were not that closely related. So what do I have next in here? So this is the different families in their order. This is an older graphic. It's not the most recent one because now they merge lilies into Asphodelaceae. But here you can see where agaves fall into place and where orchids at the very top fall into place, and asparagus. And so everybody knows what Gasterias look like, I hope. If not, here is one. So that's the most close relative of Haworthiopsis. But I wanted to touch on the two aloes that are most closely related to Haworthia, well, former aloes. That is now Camara hematifolia and Camara platypus, which is one of the tree type aloes. It's just crazy. I don't think anybody has done it, but I guess in theory you could cover that with a Haworthia and see what happens. But that's it. So I have a few Haworthiopsis here and a few Haworthias here at Tulista. If you want to take a close look at them and see what differences, what similarities you notice. But that's it.
Do you know what family Limifolia is in?
That is Haworthiopsis.
Haworthiopsis. Thanks.
Oh, I forgot one thing. So Tulistas usually have a branched inflorescence, and Haworthias and Haworthiopsis have a simple inflorescence. So it's just one stalk with flowers and it doesn't branch. Occasionally you'll have a side branch, but not consistently. That is one thing that I forgot to mention earlier. But that's it. Does anybody have any questions, comments, etc.? That's it. Now we'll have a cactus of the month, right?
Don't have a cactus of the month. I wanted to save some time because we have an amazing art project for today. So I figured now we got 2:45, so let's break for our intermission. Snacks on the table, commingle, and then 3 o'clock we'll gather back around and we'll start our craft project for this month's meeting.